Good evening, everyone. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine, and it's a particular pleasure to have Evan Friss here this evening because he's written a book that's clearly after our own hearts here at Politics and Prose. It's called The Bookshop, A History of the American Bookstore. Evan is a professor of history at James Madison University, specializing in James Madison University, yes. Yeah, specializing in U.S. and urban studies. His previous two books are about cycling, bicycles in the 1890s in urban America, and cycling over the last 200 years in New York City. Both those works placed cycling in a larger historical context, and Evan does the same with bookstores in his new book, portraying them as not merely commercial enterprises, but also as places that have played and continue to play central roles in American culture and community. There's no question he's a very biased chronicler. His deep affection for bookstores, particularly independent bookstores, is evident from the opening pages on. His wife worked in an indie, Three Lives and Company in New York's West Village, and that's where the two of them met. And his wife now has her own bookstore in Harrisonburg, Virginia, where they live. But Evan, he also gets the essence of these kind of quirky businesses. You know, he appreciates their specialness, what sets bookstores apart from other kinds of retailers, and how they've managed to survive through all kinds of challenges over the decades, which some of which I'm sure we'll be talking about in a few minutes. Each chapter of the book is set in a bookshop, one that represents an important theme in American bookselling history and speaks to a larger narrative about the power of bookshops and the changing relationships that Americans have had with them. So let's get to it. Evan and I will talk for a bit, and then we'll or he'll take questions. So Evan, welcome and congratulations.
Thank you. It's great to be here. As most of you know, this is among the most storied independent bookstores in the country today, and it's surely a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so the reviews of this book have been really terrific. Michael Durda of the Washington Post, for instance, called it both entertaining and informative. Evan just told me that he learned only a little while ago that it's going to appear on the New York Times bestseller list. So you better get your copies this evening before they run out. Anyway, how does it feel to be getting such critical and acclaim and popular success?
Strange. I wish I could say that it was I don't know, just strange, hard to comprehend. We had a book launch at my wife's bookstore on Saturday, and somebody congratulated me on being in People Magazine, the People Magazine Book of the Week, and not any of you other than my family and my wife knew me in high school. But if there was a superlative for most likely to be in People Magazine, I can assure you I was down at the bottom of the list. So it just seems very strange, and I'm incredibly grateful and delighted, and it's been a wild ride. The only downside is I don't sleep anymore. I have a lot of excitement and adrenaline, but eventually my 15 minutes will end.
Yeah, well, one thing I've learned owning bookstores, people do love their bookstores, and clearly from your experience, they love books about bookstores.
That is true. And I happen to be in very good company this year. We were just talking about Paul Yamakaze's book, Reading the Room, which I highly recommend. He's the buyer at City Lights
in San Francisco.
In San Francisco, and there are a number of excellent books recently and ongoing about bookstores, as there should be.
So, as a professor of history, I mean, you have just virtually a countless number of subjects to choose from to write a book about. Why pick bookstores?
Well, that's a good question. And I wasn't growing up somebody who spent a ton of time in bookstores. I grew up in Columbia, Maryland, not too far from here, and would occasionally go to the Barnes and Noble, which was really the only bookstore we had there. And I would say that I liked it, but I didn't exactly love it, and hung out there sometimes. And it seemed like an interesting place, but not necessarily a special place. And when I was in graduate school in New York City, studying American history, my girlfriend, now wife, aforementioned bookseller named Amanda, got a job at Three Lives and Company. And if you haven't been there, it's in the West Village of New York City on the corner of Waverly and West 10th. And bang for your buck, square footage wise, I think is the greatest bookstore on earth, other than my wife's bookstore. But it's very small, full of books, packed to the gills, and is sort of like what Politics and Prose is for DC, what Three Lives is to the Village, just an anchor of the community. And it was really a proxy experience through her and me going to the bookstore, and mostly her coming home and telling me about the space, that I got a sense of what it meant for people, some people. And even though I hadn't been, as a kid, one of those people who adored bookstores necessarily, even though I became, as I matured, a much better and more voracious reader, it was really as an adult reading more through her experience that I recognized just how important this institution was for some segment of the population, admittedly not everyone. And what she would talk about at the bookstore was often not necessarily the literature per se, but the people. And it wasn't just the booksellers, but it's also the customers that make a bookstore, and the community, and this kind of reciprocal, this relationship between customers, staffers, the space, the books, seemed to be almost magical in this small bookstore that I got to know very intimately. And I was, of course, well aware of the larger narrative and macro trends about the decline of bookstores. And so I wanted to know the history of how these spaces came to be, what bookstores were like in the 19th century, when did they first start, and why are they disappearing, and what might be lost if they in fact do disappear.
So, I mean, you write about bookstores as being, not just charming, comfortable places to go to, but you describe them also as powerful, as having influence over our tastes and thoughts and politics, as places that function as critical sites for intellectual, social, political, and cultural exchange. Explain how bookstores exercise power over us, because a lot of the time I don't feel particularly powerful.
Well, how many books were published on Tuesday? I don't thousands of books. And Bradley and his wise staff here have to curate an amazingly small collection. As many books as there are surrounding us is a tiny fraction of what's being produced in the market today. So there's the kind of just grand curation of what even gets in the store. There's, of course, your decisions about which books to highlight, lighting, sections, all sorts of choices. But then there's the kind of magical experience of hand selling, the hallmark of an independent bookstore. When somebody comes in and says, I'm looking for a book, my cousin really likes baseball and bees and used to be an ornithologist and now is into dentistry. This is admittedly a strange person, but this is what happens. And they want to read a book, but it can't be long, and hopefully it has a couple pictures in it. And a bookseller will hand this person a book that will make their cousin or whoever this person was happy. And books, as we all know, it's not, I don't think, hyperbolic to say that books can and have changed people's lives. And how we find books matters a great deal. And there are, of course, many different chains in this sort of ladder. There's the publishers that decide what gets published. And then there are the booksellers that decide what they're going to carry, which titles to amplify, who they're going to invite to sit here at these events. And it influences what people see, what they read, and what we read influences our politics, our thoughts, our opinions, our tastes. So bookstores remain influencers. And I write in the book, now I'm a regular bookseller because my wife has a bookstore and she occasionally gets sick or, wants to do yoga or something. So I get to play the role of bookseller more often. But at Three Lives, I worked one shift and I was so scared. And the owner, I can't even remember the circumstance, but people were sick or something. And the owner said, "Can you help me out and work for a couple of hours?" And I was terrified because I felt like I didn't know enough about books to help people. And they would come in and ask me about this book about dentistry or bees or whatever. And there were a couple of people who came in and asked, do you have such and such a book? And I had no idea. And they don't have computer systems there, so it was impossible to look up. But mostly, I remember just how powerful I felt. Somebody came in and just said, "What should I read?" I was like, "Really? You're asking me?" And reading is no slim commitment. These books. Bradley was just showing me Nate Silver's book, which is some kind of, 200,000 word monster. I'm sure
That's tomorrow night's book.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just giving him a plug. That's a serious commitment. You're going to spend days probably, many, many hours reading this thing. And somebody was willing to just listen to me. And why were they doing that? Not because of me, but it's because of the bookstore I was standing in. People walk into Politics and Prose, and there's a kind of authority and expertise, but also a kind of hominess. And there's nothing more empowering, but also satisfying than...
Yeah, that's the term I would use, because I think that a lot of us feel a great sense of satisfaction when we can match readers up with books maybe they would not have previously considered.
Yeah, we all like, you read something and you love it, and our first tendency is to share that with people that we also think will love it. Yeah. That's kind of human nature.
So give us a brief overview of the history of bookstores in the United States. I know you've written 300 pages about it. They read very, very quickly. But can you compress the history into, say, just a few minutes to start with?
Sure. So bookstores start as kind of blurred spaces that often involve many different dimensions. So because the colonial market for books was so small, many of the earliest booksellers were also printers, binders, wholesalers, as well as book retailers.
Like Ben Franklin.
And there weren't very many of them. And they also, like some modern bookstores, sold a lot of other stuff, what we now call sidelines. Again, because many colonial Americans weren't literate. There wasn't the same kind of media network. There weren't any New York Times bestseller lists. You like how I worked that in there? There weren't the same kind of infrastructure to allow for the kind of book business that came later. So the earliest kind of proto booksellers really didn't have bookstores like we would recognize them today. And then in the 19th century, 1820s, 1830s, we have some what I would call modern American bookstores that would feel somewhat akin to what we're used to today, with plenty of American literature on offer and also places to hang out. And then what's interesting is there's no real single model that dominates for really terribly long periods of times. The kind of paragon of what the model American bookstore is changes seemingly from generation to generation. So most of you are familiar, I'm sure, with, you know, the superstores of the 1990s and perhaps the mall stores that preceded that. But I have a chapter about Marshall Field's, which was a department store and was arguably the biggest bookseller in the United States, but was also seen as a kind of first-rate bookstore with hand selling and many of the same charms that we associate with small independent shops today.
So in terms of sort of the modern era, the last 40 or 50 years, and if you're just sort of talking numbers and sizes and so on, bookstores kind of, would you say, peaked 40 years ago in the 1980s? I mean, you had thousands and thousands of indies, but you also had these chains forming, and then what happened?
Yeah, it's hard. I'll first give a disclaimer that figuring out the number of bookstores in any given era is exceedingly difficult and is open to interpretation. What is a bookstore? What percentage of its stock has to be books to count as a bookstore? The American Booksellers Association, which you were intimately involved with for a very long time, has had different ways of calculating that. So does the United States Census. And there are good reasons to either overinflate or deflate their numbers depending on politics of a given era. So I'll just say that as a kind of general disclaimer, that it's very difficult and is hard to do. But I did the best that I can. And it's on a per capita basis, bookstores today are exceedingly rare in terms of American history. So from the Civil War era, the early 20th century, the mid 20th century, the 1980s, they were much more numerous than they are today. And throughout the 90s and early 2000s, the numbers dwindled precipitously, and there's been some stabilization. But we're at, I can't say a low point, because in the early, as I mentioned before, in the colonial days and earliest American history, there were very few bookstores, but there were also very few literate people. So comparatively, just in terms of number of bookstores, this is a relatively low point.
Well, we'll come back to this question about whether bookstores, particularly independent bookstores, are sort of a dying species. But let me ask you to talk a little bit about the politics, or politics and bookstores. I mean, I think a lot of people tend to view independent bookstores as liberal or progressive, and I think, you know, the large majority of us are, but not all bookstores, as you show, are bastions of progressive thought. A case in point is the Aryan bookstore, which you devote a chapter to, and you describe as the de facto headquarters of American Nazism when it existed. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I think all bookstores in a way are political to some degree, and I highlight a number that are very explicitly political and are intended to organize. And I wanted to include the chapter on Nazi bookstores because I didn't, as much as I do love bookstores, I didn't want it to just be a kind of poem to bookstores, an ode to bookstores. I also am a historian, and I want to tell the whole story. And for the same reason that we have activist bookstores promoting ideologies that we may be sympathetic to, it's really the same influence and power of books that other kinds of people can use bookstores for. So I thought it was important to include that chapter. And I also just thought it was really interesting that in Los Angeles, in the late 1930s, out in the open on main drags, there were Nazi bookstores, and they were doing quite well, but their real purpose was, indoctrination more than selling books, but books aided in that purpose. But this notion of a sort of indie bookstores as being progressive spaces is a very modern concept. And, if you go back far enough in time, there weren't even indie bookstores, because that was just the majority of bookstores were what we would think of as independent bookstores. They often, for much of the 20th century, referred to them as personal bookshops. But once corporate superstores, Barnes & Noble and Borders came about and became very popular, many communities rallied to save local, smaller, independent bookshops. And there became this kind of tie-in with a whole set of progressive values about community, about democratic principles that became associated and part of a kind of almost liberal indie brand, I would say.
I mean, you also have a chapter on the Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookshop, which opened in the mid-'60s in Greenwich Village and was a center of the gay rights movement. And yet another chapter was about a bookstore called Drum and Spear, which was here in Washington. Does anybody here remember that bookstore? That was in the late 60s and 70s, and it was specifically aimed to, as they put it, to encourage more black people to read more about black people. But these bookstores that were that had as part of their mission, political activism, they didn't seem to last, right? They all were very involved and had some effect at the times that they existed, but they kind of burned out, right?
Yeah, and these were stores that were always more interested in social profit than financial, but of course they needed to make money in order to survive. And Craig Rodwell, who started Oscar Wilde, I think is a really interesting kind of case study, and I found really fascinating because I didn't know much about him. And as an American historian, I knew some of the story of the gay civil rights movement, which is often told as sort of starting in the bars, and people are familiar with Stonewall. But what I realized in my research is that the bookstore was in many ways the center and the anchor of this campaign. And Rodwell, whose papers are in the New York Public Library, I spent a couple of weeks digging through all of his letters and old files, and I came across a couple of his report cards from grade school, and he failed English repeatedly. And I thought it was a great just kind of fact and anecdote, because he wasn't a book man. He wasn't a bookish person. According to people who knew him, he was never a voracious reader. He wasn't the kind of person that we, in our mind of thinking about a kind of cardigan, bespectacled bookseller who's read every book in their shop. He wanted to awaken people and enliven them to change. He was frustrated with slow-footed campaigns and thought that people needed to read more, learn more, and that there needed to be more literature and outlets for people to acquire it. So he started a bookstore without knowing anything about the book business and with knowing hardly anything about books. And the Drum and Spear example was similar in a way. They were a little more literary folks, the people who started it, but their real goal was to be another leg in a much more broad campaign for civil rights. And they thought customers needed to educate themselves. And in order to do so, they needed to access certain books, and they needed to have spaces that were welcoming for them.
So while some of these more activist bookstores have come and gone, a number have stayed. One of the most famous is the Strand in New York, which you write also about at some length. It's now in its third generation of ownership, and it's the biggest or second biggest, along with Powell's in Oregon, independent bookstore in the United States. What do you attribute to the Strand's longevity?
The Strand is an amazing store. It started out as a sidewalk stall on 4th Avenue in New York, which used to be home to something known as Booksellers Row, which was a number upon number of used bookshops almost exclusively. And many of them had different specialties. So you could go to one store and get old maps, and another store and find works in Russian, and another store for magazines, and another store for Victorian novels. And the Strand was among them, and initially not very successful. But when then the founder passed the torch over to the second generation, his name is Fred Bass, he decided to go big and sort of anticipated the desire. He writes in later years about being the first superstore and kind of preceding Barnes and Noble. But he makes a pretty big gamble and decides to buy a building, which the Strand now lives in. And a number of the most successful bookstores and the ones that have managed to survive have at some point gambled and bought the real estate, which has often been the kind of savior for them financially. And so that building is now worth a lot of money and has recently been landmarked, which set off a large fight between the Strand, which actually didn't want landmark status for the building. And I talk about that a bit in the book. So some of it is financial. Some of it has this kind of historical lore. So its history is very evident in there. And every time they've renovated the space, lots of customers have complained and asked, bring back the mice and all this kind of stuff that adds to a kind of gritty charm to the space. And there's a special, I think, allure for used books, which was what the Strand dealt in almost exclusively. In the 21st century, they've started to sell many more new books and have sold many other kind of sidelines. But it's an institution. It's also a tourist destination. When people come to New York, just like they go to Portland, this is a kind of must-see attraction. And for people who don't live near an indie, this is what they think of when they think of an indie bookstore, the Strand and the Powell's.
So personalities also play a big part in your book, as of course they do in many bookstores. You profile several quite colorful, influential booksellers of the past, like the petite but formidable Marcella Honner, known as the Tsarina at Marshall Fields in Chicago, the indefatigable apron-clad Frances Steloff at Gotham Bookmark in New York, and the cranky, bearded Bert Britton at the Strand, who worked in the basement and proved an unlikely socialite. What is it about bookstores being such sort of idiosyncratic expressions of the humans who run it or manage them?
Yeah, somewhere in the book, I can't remember exactly which chapter at this point, but I say bookstores are weird, which was a quote from somebody who had worked in a number of bookstores. And I think it's true. And back to the story of how I began to write this book, Amanda would often talk about regular customers and eccentric customers who were often one and the same. And it's also just part of the kind of diversity of the kinds of people who are attracted to bookstores. They represent a whole cross-section of society in a number of different ways. But I think you also have to be a little bit crazy to go into bookselling. And it's an all-consuming passion. It's not typically very financially rewarding. Often the people are either motivated, like I mentioned, Craig Rodwell and the Drum and Spear activists, by mission, or people just really love books. There's one character who you mentioned, whose name is Bert Britton, who I wish I could write a whole book about or make a documentary of, but there's very little information about him. But yeah,
With the Strand.
at the Strand, who was, according to everybody who knew him and news reports, the most bookish man in America for like 2 years. And he was this nobody who walked into the Strand one day depressed shortly after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and he just kept hanging out. And so they said, why don't you start working here? And he started working in the underground where they sold review copies. So when the publishers send galleys out to booksellers, eventually some of those end up finding their way on the market. And this was sort of his fiefdom. And he became very good friends with so many famous authors that he once had this book party for him, because he used to make friends with authors and ask them to write portraits of themselves. And he collected them and published this book. And at this party was Kurt Vonnegut and Saul Bellow and Norman Mailer and like every giant of American literature in this moment, like hundreds of these people. I'm convinced this was the greatest literary gathering of all time. And it was for this guy who worked in the basement at the Strand, whose ego eventually got in his own way. But that's another story.
Okay, so we talked about bookstores and their eccentric managers, but we also have to talk about bookstores and pets, right? And in fact, you have a short section on Wonton, the tuxedo cat, who presided over a store in Richmond, Virginia. And in fact, just like here at P&P and in many bookstores around the country, they have a thing about pets. Why?
Well, I think they add to the homey atmosphere of what can make a bookstore feel so comfortable. They make the spaces feel alive. Wonton, may he rest in peace. He's no longer here, but they have two other cats at Shelf Life Books in Richmond, Virginia. Was in 21st century utilitarianness was also an Instagram star, which was helpful for the bookshop in certain ways. Some of you may follow Ann Patchett and her bookshop in Nashville, Tennessee. Her dog, or several dogs, are frequently in the shop and accompany her on her Instagram videos. So people love dogs. There's a kind of old adage, if you want to write a bestseller, have the word Lincoln and dogs in the title, like Lincoln's Blue Dog or something like that. People just love dogs. It makes them feel comfortable. And when you walk into a retail space, you're not usually typically in many other kinds of environments see dogs or cats walking around the aisle. At the Gotham Book Mart, Frances Steloff always had a cat, and she named them after her famous, her favorite authors at the time. I think there were three of them. The last one was Pynchon, but she had Christopher Morley, and I can't remember the other ones.
It's hard to talk about the book business without talking a little bit about Amazon, but I'm going to try to avoid the subject. I mean, you do have a chapter on Amazon, although it's about how they failed when they tried to open their own bricks and mortar stores a few years ago. They got to as many as 24 or 25 around the country, including 2 here in the Washington area, and they just didn't work because I think they found that running a bricks and mortar business trying to sell books is hard, so they've gone back to just selling online. I want to come back to the issue of whether bookstores are going to survive or not, particularly indie bookstores, because you say in your book that the fact that bookstores continue to endure is in some ways something of a miracle. If bookstores were animals, you write, they'd be on the list of endangered species. But you also note, and this is quite true, that hand-wringing over the future of bookstores has existed for decades. You cite a famous quip by a bookseller back in 1961 that books have been a dying business for 5,000 years. Now, 13 years ago, when Lissa and I assumed ownership of Politics and Prose, people were very seriously predicting, the demise of physical books and the disappearance of bookstores because, ebooks were just a few years old at that time and were all the rage, and there had been this precipitous decline in the number, particularly of independent bookstores, through the 90s and 2000s. Clearly, we haven't disappeared. In fact, there's been a bit of a resurgence over the last decade and a half in independent bookstores. So how endangered are we really? Have maybe reports of our death been somewhat greatly exaggerated?
So precarity has always been a theme of the book selling business, and for good reason. It's, as I mentioned before, and as we've talked about before, it's a low profit margin business with a lot of different challenges. And I think people had good reason to think, based on the first few years of Kindle, that everybody was going to start reading ebooks and we wouldn't have bookstores anymore. And people had good reason to think, when televisions came around, that everyone was just going to watch TV all the time. And when radios came along, and when mass market paperbacks came along, and when Amazon came along. And Amazon, I think, no doubt, in the long history of American bookselling, has been the most transformative force in bookselling and publishing, and has been, the closest thing to an existential threat to brick and mortar bookstores. That said, everybody's always been wrong in these predictions, as you alluded to. And I think in recent years, and I think many of the people shopping in here today, everybody knows they can get every one of these books on Amazon today and get it delivered to their house in 2 days at the same price, or often for a cheaper price. And so we're choosing to be here, and sometimes despite Amazon, sometimes in spite of Amazon. And I think there are lots of communities that are energized and willing to support their local bookstore and appreciate the benefits that it offers to the community. So I think in the kind of, now my guess, which is not worth any more than anyone else's guess, is that we're not going to see, tons and tons of new bookstores opening, that we're not going to return to the kind of numbers that we once had, but that there's still plenty of opportunity for many independent stores to succeed. And if the shops are in the right places and they're run the right way and they have the right kind of communities to support them, that they'll flourish.
Well, I hope you're right. And I'm going to stop asking my questions at this point and invite any of you who would like to step over to the microphone.
Yeah, thank you so much for your comments there. I was wondering if you could give some thoughts on bookstores and libraries and the relationship between those two institutions. Like, how have they sort of existed next to each other over time? And to what extent do you see them as like competitors versus complementary institutions?
Yeah, great question. So for the earliest parts of American history, there really weren't public libraries. The taxpayer system of funded libraries came about in the late 19th century. And when they did, it was another death knell for bookstores. So booksellers said, we can't have these institutions that are giving away books for free. But for much of the early history, there was a kind of symbiotic relationship between the two. I mentioned Marshall Fields before. A lot of department stores had lending libraries where they would charge a couple of cents a day, where bookstores would provide both roles, again, before there were commonly public libraries much more widely spread across the United States. But throughout the 20th century, when that became much more common, there was certainly fear that this would imperil the book business, and it just didn't in the way that naysayers expected. And every bookseller I know loves the library. I don't know how you feel, Bradley, but supports the library and thinks it's a kind of great complement to bookstores. People know that they can access books and they don't have to pay for them. I'm very happy. I hope people buy my book, and that's great. But I also I love the fact that people can go to a library and just read it. So I think they can coexist, and they have for a long time, and they both serve different purposes, even if overlapping.
I seem to buy all so many books here, and thanks, Brad. But I've noticed, I especially like art books, and I've noticed that almost every book I buy here is one I knew nothing about when I walked in. So for me, a good bookstore is like a curator, because I occasionally look at publishers' catalogs, and even the best publishers publish books that are not terribly wonderful. And to me, the function of a good bookseller is picking out the really good books, and perhaps, if you're lucky, the really great books.
Yeah, the chance that somebody walks into a bookstore and leaves with a title they didn't expect to buy is several times higher than if you go on Amazon. So there's this discovery, serendipitous experience that's very common here and not so common online.
Yeah, I will mention I've only bought one book from Amazon, and it was a hard to get to book from Europe. But one thing I do like Amazon is if you go online and you search for a book, they always have a photo of the cover and recommendations on similar books. And I've occasionally wound up buying one of the similar books, and I think that's thanks to Amazon, though. Like I say, I've just only bought one book from them.
And speaking of covers, publishers will tell you that they design covers now to look good on Amazon. It's a whole different way of designing books. I've seen a book where the back cover was an advertisement for another book. And the logic was, if somebody already bought that book, they don't need to be convinced to buy it, because on Amazon, you never see the reverse side of the jacket, the verso. So the whole way publishers and marketers and agents think about which books to bring out to the market, how to market them, has oriented not completely to Amazon, but heavily tilted in that direction.
Evan, do you have any thoughts about that algorithm on Amazon, that if you like this book, that you'll love this other one?
I think it's tapping into a good impulse of what independent stores are trying to do, is figure out what you like and then make recommendations based on that. If you go into a bookshop and you say, I'm looking for a recommendation, the bookseller will almost always respond, well, what do you like to read? So I think it makes sense, but of course it lacks a human touch, and it's the conversation that makes that transaction so meaningful.
My questions, I think, are a little bit linked. So first question is, what were your early experiences yourself as a child with books? What excited you about books? What kind of books? And then could you talk a little bit about children's bookstores in the context of your book? We're very fortunate to have a very strong children's section here, but I don't know if that's always the case. Are there standalone independent bookstores? Do they do well?
So since especially ebooks, a lot of independent bookstores have beefed up their children's section, because many parents, even if they read on a Kindle, want to read a picture book to their child. So that has been something that Amazon hasn't mastered nearly as well. And so independence over the last 10, 20 years have generally expanded their children's section, and there are some exclusively children's bookstores, indie bookstores that are great. I've been to one in New York City. So I think they occupy a great space. And some of the best customers are grandmothers or parents who come in with their kids, and the kid says, I want this book. And it's a little harder to say no than if they want a piece of candy or something at the supermarket, right? I think we all feel guilty, or, yeah, of course we should buy them this book. My own experiences growing up, I was a reader, but again, not probably likely to have written this book based on what I was reading as a kid. And I think I matured sort of late as a reader, and in high school got much more interested and read a much wider, diverse range of books, and have just kind of kept getting to be a better and better reader. But I'm still not as good as my wife.
Thank you.
Hello. I'm
Hi.
a little short, so.
That's okay.
Just pull it
Pull
down.
it down.
Yeah.
All right. Oops.
Oh, just hold it in your hand.
Oh, all right. I will. I'll hold it in my hand. First of all, I would just like to comment that reading the book made me, your language, the way you put words together, made me feel exactly as I feel when I come here, which is I feel that I am home.
Well, thank you. It's very sweet of you to say.
You captured it so beautifully. And I have a question that kind of would go to both of you. I am a colleague and friend of a few people on the West Coast, namely Praveen Madden and Peggy Holman. And I've become aware of the fact that during the pandemic, about 600 independent bookstore owners came together and spent the 2 years of the pandemic reimagining their bookshops. And I wonder if you know of any of what's become of that, what evolution has occurred socially and community-wise, et cetera, in terms of reimagining oneself for the future, because we are all hoping there'll be a great future.
Well, that project is ongoing. They haven't come up with any surefire solution. You see, in their case, they own Kepler's in Palo Alto. They've had some success with a nonprofit model that is not turning their entire bookstore into a nonprofit, but splitting off like the events operation and creating a nonprofit around that. And some other bookstores are pursuing similar approaches. But, you know, we're all still sort of struggling, trying to find what will work. One great thing about the independent bookselling community is that it is extremely collegial. There's a national idea exchange every year called the Winter Institute. There are strong regional associations around the country at which booksellers gather and compare notes. And so, you know, if anybody does come up with a great idea, it gets communicated very quickly. But I just don't think there is one magic solution for all of us. It's, you know, I use the baseball analogy that we're not going to come up with any home runs. It's just a matter of just trying to get a single or a double.
Well, it's a complexity, but we are hopeful for you. And so hoping that if there's anything we can do to contribute, we'd be happy to be there. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
One brief question, and I'll caveat this with, of course, other than your wife's, as you research the book, do you have a favorite bookstore, current or past?
Other than this one and my wife's and Three Lives, which is the one she used to work at and I have a lot of friends at. I would say also in New York City, there's a bookstore called McNally Jackson, and there's a few of them, but there's one in the South Street Seaport that just aesthetically perfectly fits my vibe. It feels like this old house, and it has these exposed brick walls, and there's arches, and everything is so perfectly illuminated, and it just feels like a place you want to hang out and, you know, have a glass of wine or whatever you like to drink and just be there. It's just so warm and pleasing.
I mean, people are, as you know, I'm sure, very particular about their bookstores, and everybody seems to have a favorite. And in fact, Evan includes an apology at the beginning of his book to everybody who picks up his book, looking to see if their bookstore is recognized. And I mean, he apologizes. I can't cover all of them. You know, I mean, there are now 2,500 just members of the American Booksellers Association, and quite a few others that are not members. But that said, Evan covers a lot of ground and does highlight quite a few of the iconic bookstores. Yes. Oh, Ron Tucker, our longest-serving employee.
You've written a book on the history of the American bookstore. I'm kind of wondering, did you limit it to America because of scope or because American history is your expertise? Or is there some other reason why you don't address bookstores around the world, because they certainly precede us? And regardless of your answer, could you tell us if there's something interesting about that differs in a positive or negative way that distinguishes the American bookstore experience from European or other?
Yes, there is a very interesting story, and you're going to have to wait 10 years till I write that book, the Bookshop, A History of the Bookstore Across the World. I did think about it, and honestly, a lot of it just had to do with constraints. Writing this book in the size of the book that it is felt like an incredible challenge because it's such a survey and there's so much that I left out. And some of it had to do with my expertise. And I really just enjoy digging deep and the research part of it. So I wanted to have these kind of portraitures of individuals and individual bookstores because I thought it was an interesting way to tell a story, but it's also what I'm interested in. I like to sort of get to do primary source research and spend weeks in archives and digging up kinds of things, and to write a kind of global history of the bookstore would necessarily, it's not a bad thing, but it would necessarily be a very different kind of research proposition. And I think it would be a great book. And I've come across many interesting things. And of course, the history of bookselling goes back long before the United States was a country. So that's not really a good answer, other than there are just so many constraints. I at one point thought about writing a much more narrow book about the bookshop in the bookstores in New York City or a smaller period of time. So this is actually kind of an expanded version of some other versions I had, but not quite as expansive as a global history would be. And I don't have language skills, but I think it would be a good book. And there's a lot of interesting stories to tell. Yeah.
Any other questions? Well, all right. Well, thank you again, Evan. And I would encourage all of you, if you haven't already picked up a copy, to do so. It's truly an informative, authoritative, engaging book. And if you love this place and love visiting bookstores, I'm sure you will, like one of those who came to the microphone said, it evokes the feeling that you all feel coming into a bookstore.
Thanks for having me. This is my first stop on book tour, and I could think of no better place. And I apologize to Brad when we were talking in the green room that Politics and Prose and you individually only get name checked a few times. And so you deserve much more space, but there are limitations. But this is such an amazing institution. And if you go around and do the kind of research I did, it's amazing how many times this store comes up and how many people I met who have some history here of being a customer here or having worked here. So this is really a wondrous institution, and I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you. Let's give Evan a hand.